The oxygen monitor was screaming a flat, chilling line when Dr. Althea Vance plunged her hands deep into the chest of the richest man in the state. She was a brilliant black surgeon, saving the life of Sterling Thorne, a notorious white billionaire whose wealth was built on a toxic foundation of prejudice. She fought for his breath, ignored the weight of his reputation, and against all odds, she won. But when Sterling Thorne finally opened his eyes, he didn't offer a word of gratitude. Instead, his glare pinned the doctor to the spot. "You, get that filth out of my room," he rasped, his voice weak but venomous, pointing a shaking finger directly at Althea. The whole ICU wing fell silent. Althea didn't flinch, didn't speak a single word of defense. She just looked at the man she had pulled from death, her eyes conveying a cold, deadly certainty. She knew she had just unleashed a storm far worse than any heart condition. "You'll regret speaking to me that way," she thought, as she turned and walked away. He was alive, he was furious, and he had no idea who he had just messed with. And that, in a world of betrayal and revenge, was just the beginning. Before we continue, let us know what you think in the comments below. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Dr. Althea Vance, 32 years old, was known as the rising star in Chicago's most exclusive medical center. She wasn't just smart, she was relentlessly driven, the kind of doctor who saw every heartbeat as a personal challenge. Althea carried the quiet ambition of two generations. Her father, a civil rights attorney, and her mother, a dedicated community nurse, who had sacrificed everything so she could wear those surgical scrubs. This evening, though, she was facing a case that felt less like medicine and more like a political battleground. The patient was one of the most hated and powerful men in America. The automatic doors of the emergency department burst open, and a swarm of paramedics wheeled in the gurney, shouting vitals that sounded like a death sentence. It was Sterling Thorne, the notorious billionaire, pulled from the wreckage of a high-speed crash. He was already coding, his gray face a stark contrast to the blinding white sheets. Every doctor on the floor hesitated, knowing the scrutiny that would follow if this man died on their watch. They all knew his reputation, his history of inflammatory public statements, and the depth of his prejudice. Althea didn't hesitate. She pushed past the attending physician, her voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. His heart was failing, and standard protocols wouldn't bring him back. She looked at the monitor, then at his pallid skin, and made a choice that could end her career. She decided on an emergency, off-label procedure, a risky, last-ditch effort that was technically brilliant but completely unsanctioned. She felt the weight of her mentor's old warning. Treating a thorn isn't about saving a life, Althea. It's about surviving the spotlight. For a fleeting second, the image of her grandmother, always telling her to keep your head down and focus, flashed in her mind. But Althea couldn't keep her head down now. She was fighting for a man who openly despised everything she stood for, yet her oath was absolute. She worked in a silent, determined frenzy, her hands moving with surgical grace and speed, completely tuning out the terrified whispers of the nurses around her. The tension was so thick the air felt metallic, burning in her lungs as she pushed past the limits of her endurance. She completed the complex maneuver. There was a gasp in the room as the monitor beeped once, weakly, a heartbeat, a frail, fluttering rhythm that promised life. Althea let out a small, silent breath of relief. For a moment, she had won. Her gamble had paid off, and Sterling Thorne was still alive. She stepped back, exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. The attending physician nodded, his face pale but respectful. She had done the impossible. She had saved him. The whole room seemed to sag with exhausted relief. But the sound of the monitor suddenly changed. The steady, quiet beat of a struggling heart faltered, then grew ragged. A shrill, continuous tone erupted, shattering the brief silence, and slamming the adrenaline back into Althea's veins. It was the dreaded sound that means only one thing. The line on the monitor went flat, a long, devastating green streak. Sterling Thorne's heart had stopped. The flat line was a punch to the gut, but Althea didn't let panic win. She grabbed the defibrillator paddles herself, her focus laser sharp. The other doctor started to argue, citing the patient's prior advance directives, but Althea ignored him. "Clear," she yelled, pressing the paddles to Thorne's chest. The sound of the electric charge snapping through the air was deafening in the sterile room. Thorne's body convulsed, then relaxed. Everyone held their breath, staring at the monitor, willing the line to jump. The line bounced, a weak but undeniable signal. Then another and another. A slow, steady rhythm began to beat, stronger this time. He was back. Althea slowly lowered the paddles, her arms shaking, not from weakness, but from the immense mental strain. The team moved instantly to stabilize him, adjusting drips and monitors. She had pulled him back from the brink of death not once, but twice. It was a spectacular, exhausting victory. Later, outside the private ICU room, Althea was approached by Dr. Henderson, the chief of staff, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Henderson was stern, his voice low and cautious. "Dr. Vance, your actions tonight were extraordinary, but the procedure was highly irregular. Given the patient's public profile, we need to be very clear about why you took such a massive risk." He wasn't praising her. He was warning her of the potential consequences. Althea stood taller, meeting his gaze. "I saw a path to life where protocol offered only death. I documented everything, Dr. Henderson. My ethical obligation is to the patient, regardless of his wallet or his name. If I had followed the rule book, he would be gone." Her defense was simple and unshakable. She knew that doing the right thing in this hospital, especially for a man like Thorne, was never just about medicine. She felt a flicker of hope, thinking the crisis was over, but that hope was quickly crushed. As she walked by Thorne's private room to check his latest charts, she saw a slight movement inside. He was awake. His eyes were open, cloudy blue, and staring directly at her as she hesitated in the doorway. He was confused, weak, and clearly struggling to breathe, but his lips moved, trying to form a word. Althea moved toward the room instinctively, ready to check his vitals, a feeling of professional pride washing over her. She had saved this terrible, powerful man. He saw her, a young black woman in a white coat, leaning over him. He grimaced, his lips twisting in disgust, and then his first fully conscious word, rasping and vile, cut through the quiet room like a knife. It was a racist slur directed with cold, hateful precision right at her. He woke up, and he was absolutely furious. The immediate sound of that slur hung in the air, a poisonous, thick cloud that choked the room. Althea froze, the medical chart slipping from her numb fingers. For a second, the doctor vanished, replaced by a daughter and a woman who had spent her life fighting that exact kind of venom. The nurses quickly moved to calm Sterling Thorne, but the damage was already done. His rage was immediate and absolute, his eyes burning with furious prejudice. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a man in a tailor-made suit walked in, looking like he owned the building. This was Graham Thorne, Sterling's son, a man in his late 40s with the same cold eyes and an air of detached arrogance. Graham immediately understood the situation and shot Althea a warning glance. "Father, please, you need a rest," he said smoothly, trying to smooth over the outburst, but the words were empty. Graham immediately pulled Althea out into the hallway, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Dr. Vance, I apologize for my father's outdated opinions. He's heavily medicated and clearly confused." He wasn't apologizing. He was making excuses and subtly threatening her to keep silent. Althea looked at him, her expression hardening into pure professional resolve. "Mr. Thorne, my report will reflect the patient's verbal state and his refusal to cooperate," she stated, making it clear she wouldn't be bullied. Later that evening, Althea finally sat down in the hospital cafeteria, calling her best friend, Kiera, a fellow doctor from a different wing. "He called me." That Althea whispered, the adrenaline gone, leaving only bitter exhaustion. Kiera's voice was firm. "You saved his life, Althea. Let the whole world know what kind of man he is. You don't have to protect him." Althea felt a flicker of righteous anger, knowing Kiera was right. She wouldn't let him steal her dignity. Althea was still sitting in the cafeteria when Graham Thorne found her, slipping a thick envelope onto the table. It was heavy with cash. "This is from the Thorne family, Doctor. A token of our profound gratitude for saving my father's life," he said, his smile thin and chilling. The gesture felt more like a payout than a thank you. He looked her directly in the eye, his voice lowering to a barely audible threat. "Inside the envelope is also an NDA, Dr. Vance. Sign it, and this whole incident goes away, along with any, shall we say, misunderstandings about your medical procedure tonight." He made it clear the money was not just gratitude. It was an attempt to buy her silence and protect his family's image. It was a massive sum, an obscene offer that represented a direct and corrupt challenge to her character. Althea stared at the envelope, the money feeling like a dirty, heavy weight. Althea didn't even touch the envelope. She looked at the sealed brown paper and then back at Graham Thorne, her voice quiet but firm enough to carry the weight of her refusal. "I saved your father's life, Mr. Thorne. My compensation is my salary and the satisfaction of upholding my oath. I will not sign an agreement to cover up his racism or your family's attempts to manipulate this hospital." She pushed the envelope back toward him, the gesture definitive and deeply insulting to his sense of power. Graham's face twisted in controlled fury. He was used to everyone bowing to the Thorne name. He grabbed the envelope, his jaw tight. "You've made a mistake, Doctor. A very expensive one." Althea simply walked away, her mind already shifting from the present fight to the deeper foundations of her resolve. She didn't need his money. She needed her dignity, a lesson she learned long ago, sitting in her grandfather's study. She remembered the scent of his old books and the sound of his careful, patient voice. "Dignity is a shield, Althea," he'd said, showing her a framed picture of him marching during the civil rights movement. "They can steal your things, they can lie about your name, but they can't take your self-respect unless you give it to them." That memory solidified her courage, reminding her that this fight was bigger than a single slur in a hospital room. It was a generational battle. She spent the next day trying to shake off the unsettling encounter, focusing on her research for an upcoming community project. This project was close to her heart, fighting to save the beloved nursing home in her old neighborhood, the one where her own grandmother was now a resident. The developers who owned the land were pushing aggressive deadlines to clear the property for a new, high-end luxury complex. It was a fight the community was losing. As Althea dug through the publicly available blueprints and ownership filings for the demolition project, her blood ran cold. The holding company listed as the primary developer was not a local firm, as she had always thought, but a shell corporation. She followed the paper trail, drilling down through layers of financial opacity, until the ultimate parent company was revealed. The name flashed on her screen, huge and undeniable, making her gasp in shock. The entity financing the entire luxury condo development, the one that would displace her community and force her grandmother out of her home, was a subsidiary of Thorne Industries. Sterling Thorne's name, the man whose life she had just saved, was listed right there, at the very top of the ownership structure. The conflict wasn't just about a racist slur anymore. It was about betrayal and revenge, a personal invasion of her world. Althea immediately called Graham Thorne, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "The nursing home development. Don't tell me you don't know about it, Graham. It's Thorn Industries, she said, her voice sharp and accusatory. He responded with cool, practiced evasion. Ah, yes, doctor. We have thousands of subsidiary projects. I can assure you that the development division operates entirely separately from the healthcare and personal division. It's purely a business decision, nothing personal. Althea immediately called Graham Thorne, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. The nursing home development. Don't tell me you don't know about it, Graham. It's Thorn Industries, she said, her voice sharp and accusatory. He responded with cool, practiced evasion. Ah, yes, doctor. We have thousands of subsidiary projects. I can assure you that the development division operates entirely separately from the healthcare and personal division. It's purely a business decision, nothing personal. She felt dismissed and deeply insulted. She knew he was lying, or at least covering up the callous indifference of his family's empire. She decided to go back to the hospital, needing to see the man himself, the root of all this chaos. During her rounds, she paused by Sterling's room. He was looking slightly better, sitting up, but his face held a look of profound, exhausted defeat, not the old, arrogant rage. He seemed smaller and vulnerable, like a man suddenly stripped of his power. As she entered the room to adjust his foredrip, she noticed him fumbling quickly with a small object under his pillow. It was a faded sepia-toned photograph, and she caught a quick glimpse of the woman in the picture before he snatched it back and hid it. The woman had a haunting, familiar face, dark eyes, high cheekbones, and a resolute expression that was strikingly and undeniably similar to Althea's own. It was a resemblance that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Who was that? Althea asked, ignoring his glare, sensing a crack in the armor of his arrogance. Sterling just grunted, turning his head away and refusing to answer, his lips drawn into a thin, stubborn line. The refusal only amplified Althea's curiosity, suggesting the photograph held a deep, hidden key to his past. She left the room feeling more confused than ever, the image of the woman haunting her. She was driving home later that evening, thinking about the mysterious photograph, when the radio volume was suddenly overwhelmed by a news bulletin. The serious voice of the anchor began detailing a shocking allegation against a local surgeon. Sources close to the Thorne family allege that Dr. Althea Vance, the doctor who saved billionaire Sterling Thorne's life, performed a reckless and highly dangerous procedure, possibly amounting to malpractice. The broadcast went on, quoting anonymous hospital sources and describing Althea's actions as arrogant and medically unsound. The report showed a grainy picture of her, making her look guilty and incompetent. It was a transparent, calculated, and professional smear campaign, clearly leaked by the Thorne family to destroy her reputation and preempt any public fallout from Sterling's racist outburst. The attack was launched not just against her career, but against her very life. The extreme event landed on Althea's front porch in the form of a legal document, heavy with the Thorne family's expensive paper and stamped with the seal of a high-powered law firm. It was the formal notice. The Thorne family was suing Dr. Althea Vance for malpractice. The baseless claim cited the reckless, high-risk procedure she had performed to save Sterling's life and used the carefully leaked news report as its primary evidence. They were trying to spin a heroic act into a criminal mistake, a vicious move designed to ruin her. Althea didn't panic. She called the only person she truly trusted with this fight, her father, Curtis Vance, a sharp, seasoned civil rights lawyer who had faced down giants before. He arrived instantly, his face grim but his resolve iron. "They're trying to intimidate you, baby girl," he said, spreading the papers across her kitchen table. "They want you to fold because the cost of fighting a billionaire is usually bankruptcy, not justice. But we won't fold." The less extreme event was the quiet determination of her family. Her mother brought over a massive pot of comfort food, and the three of them, Althea, Curtis, and her mother, stayed up late, going over every medical note, every signature, and every procedure from that night. Curtis insisted on not just defending her, but filing a ferocious countersuit, turning the table on the Thornes. It was a moment of deep connection, a reminder that her strength was rooted in the people who loved her. "They're not just attacking me, Dad," Althea mused, looking out the window. "They're attacking the fact that I survived their patient. They're attacking everything we stand for." Curtis nodded, proud of her clarity. The case felt like a chess match, a slow, high-stakes duel. But the Thornes had one last card to play before the legal fight could even begin. The extreme event struck the next morning. Althea was called into Dr. Henderson's office. His demeanor was nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. He explained that due to the high-profile nature of the pending litigation and the unsettling media coverage, the hospital board had made a decision. She was being placed on immediate administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. It was a soft firing, an official expulsion from the work she loved, and it meant her career was essentially frozen. The Thorne influence was so deep, it had cut her off from the thing that defined her most, being a surgeon. She knew this wasn't temporary. This was them trying to crush her. The fight moved from the operating room to the courtroom. The extreme event was Althea's father, Curtis, holding an aggressive press conference right outside the courthouse. He didn't just defend his daughter. He went on the offense, challenging the ethical responsibility of the Thorne family and questioning why a patient, after being saved by a brilliant doctor, would immediately try to destroy her career. The legal war was officially public, noisy, and full of raw controversy. The less extreme event was a necessary retreat to find emotional strength. Althea drove to the Maplewood Assisted Living Facility, the nursing home her grandmother, Ruth, called home, the same home Sterling Thorne's company was trying to tear down. Ruth was a pillar of quiet strength, and she knew Althea was struggling. As they sat on a worn, floral sofa, Ruth looked into Althea's eyes. "That man's hate is old, Althea," Ruth said, her voice soft but strong. "I remember when this place was just a run-down schoolhouse. They tried to take the land then, too. Said our people weren't suitable neighbors for the new suburbs. We fought them with bake sales and picket signs. They lost that time. They don't change, Althea. They just get richer, and the lies get bigger." The story wasn't just history. It was a clear map of the present conflict, connecting Althea's surgical battle to her community battle. The conversation renewed Althea's commitment. She went back to her father's study, determined to find a weakness in the Thorne armor, a history they were hiding. She wasn't just preparing a defense. She was looking for a weapon. She spent days buried in old documents, public records, and archives. Then late one night, deep in a digital archive of old newspapers, she found it. The extreme event was the headline from a paper dated 50 years ago, yellowed and faded. High society scandal. Thorne heir implicated in family trust fund suit. The story detailed a messy, racially charged dispute over a trust fund that disappeared after a brief, scandalous marriage. The bride in the article was quickly divorced and erased from the Thorne history. But the most shocking part was the name of the family that sued for the trust, the family who mysteriously dropped the case after a massive, secret payout. It was Vance, Althea's last name. The newspaper clipping lay flat on Curtis Vance's mahogany desk, a 50-year-old receipt for a massive injustice. The extreme event was the silent, profound realization that swept over Althea and her father. Sterling Thorne hadn't just mistreated a young black doctor. He had likely cheated their own family out of generational wealth and happiness decades ago. The old scandal wasn't just a political battle. It was a devastating personal secret that connected Althea's lineage directly to the source of Sterling's power. Curtis, normally stoic, looked shaken. "This changes everything, Althea." This is why he was so furious. He recognized the name, or maybe he recognized you. Althea felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. She needed to know more. and the only person who held the full truth, however fragmented, was Sterling himself. The less extreme event was Althea doing something rash. Ignoring her father's firm advice, she drove back to the hospital. She had her staff ID badge, technically still valid, and she walked past the security straight to the private ICU wing. The moment felt heavy with destiny. She slipped into Sterling's room. He was awake, weak, and guarded by a private nurse who quickly stepped out. "It wasn't just a coincidence, was it, Mr. Thorne?" Althea asked, her voice low. She didn't mention the lawsuit or the land development. Instead, she took the photograph she had seen him hide, a picture of the beautiful, dark-eyed woman, and placed it on the table next to his bed. "Tell me about her. Tell me about Alara." The name came from a note attached to the old newspaper clipping, and it was a direct shot in the dark. Sterling's eyes widened in raw terror. For a brief, horrible moment, the arrogance was gone, replaced by pure, desperate guilt. He stared at the photograph, then at Althea, her reflection in his own bloodline, staring back at him. He tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound came out. The monitor above his head began to shriek, the rhythm suddenly erratic and frantic. The extreme event was sudden and devastating. Sterling Thorne was having another major medical event. His body seized, his eyes rolled back, and the monitor screamed faster, signaling a massive, uncontrolled internal crisis. Althea, the doctor, instinctively jumped forward to save the man who had wronged her family twice over. As she worked to stabilize him, fighting for the life of the racist billionaire, he seized one final time, his eyes briefly locking onto hers in a moment of agonizing lucidity. "Forgive," he rasped before crying out a name that confirmed Althea's darkest suspicion, a final, powerful whisper, "Alara Vance." The name hung in the chaotic air, Alara Vance. It was the most extreme event yet, a secret detonating inside the sterile confines of the ICU. Althea worked with furious, professional focus, stabilizing Sterling's compromised condition, the sound of her own gray-tant's name ringing in her ears. The truth was now undeniable. She and Sterling Thorne were linked not by chance, but by a horrific, covered-up history of family betrayal. Once the medical team regained control of the crisis, Althea left the room, her composure barely holding. The less extreme event was the terrifying, sleepless night that followed. She couldn't call her father yet. She needed absolute proof. She found her grandmother Ruth's old photo albums and family Bible. Tucked inside were handwritten notes and dates. She cross-referenced every date of Alara Vance's short life with a newspaper clipping. It all lined up. Alara had a secret marriage, a sudden disappearance from the family history, and then the mysterious, short-lived lawsuit against the Thornes. The pieces came together in a devastating mosaic. Alara Vance was Althea's great-aunt. She had married a young Sterling Thorne against his family's wishes, and when she became pregnant, the powerful Thorne family orchestrated a cover-up, stealing her rightful inheritance and erasing her from history, leading to her heartbroken and early death. Althea realized that her own ambition and brilliance, the things she was taught to value, were unknowingly a form of generational revenge on the family that tried to ruin her lineage. She finally called her father, laying out the full, sickening scope of the discovery. Curtis was silent on the other end, the shock palpable even through the phone line. This was no longer a malpractice defense. It was a criminal case about inheritance, betrayal, and racial prejudice that spanned half a century. Althea was the last person on Earth Sterling Thorne expected to save him, or to uncover his greatest secret. Althea decided she needed to tell Sterling that she knew the truth, to make him look at the history he tried to bury. She returned to the hospital the next morning, but she never made it to the room. The extreme event happened as she turned the corner toward the private wing. Graham Thorne was waiting. He looked as sleek and cold as ever, but his eyes were blazing with a raw, dangerous panic. He wasn't surprised to see her. He had been tracking her every move. He looked from Althea's face to a hidden digital photograph on his phone, then back to Althea. His face went gray with dawning, furious comprehension. He had seen the resemblance to the mysterious woman in his father's old photos before, but now he saw the full, horrifying truth. He knew she had found out about Alara Vance. He knew Althea was not just a doctor, but a Vance, a ghost from his father's worst secrets, and she was poised to destroy the entire Thorne legacy. The confrontation was immediate, the most extreme event since the flatline. Graham grabbed Althea's arm, his grip surprisingly strong and threatening, pulling her into a seldom-used corridor. "You need to stop digging, Doctor," he hissed, his usual smoothness completely gone. "You're playing a dangerous game that you can't win. This is my family's private history, and you have no right to it. You will regret pushing this." Althea didn't flinch. She pulled her arm away, her face a mask of cold resolve. "Your father's history involves my family's stolen future, Graham. That makes it my right and my duty." She could see the fear behind his anger. He was terrified of the truth coming out, not just because of the money, but because of the deep, moral rot it exposed at the core of the Thorne name. The stakes had been raised again. It was no longer just about a job. It was a direct confrontation over familial justice. The less extreme event was Althea attempting to find a key witness. She hunted down an old administrative assistant who worked for Sterling Thorne during the time of the scandal, a woman named Francine. Francine was now retired, living quietly in a small apartment complex. When Althea found her, Francine was terrified, claiming she remembered nothing. But as Althea pleaded, sharing the story of Alara and the stolen future, Francine's hardened shell cracked. "I can't talk, honey," Francine whispered, her eyes darting nervously. "Graham, he watches everything. But I can tell you this. Follow the paperwork trail. Not the trust fund, but the divorce records. That's where the real proof is buried, where the pressure was applied." It was a tiny clue, but a vital one, confirming that Graham was just continuing his father's decades-long pattern of cover-ups. Althea was back at her office, processing this new lead, when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, starting with a 212 area code, Manhattan, the heart of Thorne's financial empire. The voice on the other end was a slick, calm partner at one of the world's most powerful law firms. "Dr. Vance," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with false deference, "Mr. Thorne has authorized a final, incredibly generous offer." The extreme event was the offer itself, an immediate payment of $50 million to Althea. This wasn't a settlement for the malpractice suit. This was an obscene payoff. The terms were simple: drop her countersuit, get Sterling the best rehabilitation care money could buy, and, most importantly, sign a permanent, ironclad NDA forbidding her from ever mentioning the name Alara Vance or researching the Thorne family history again. It was a final, desperate move to silence the truth forever, but the price tag showed just how terrifyingly big that truth truly was. The extreme event was the biggest gamble of Althea's life. She looked at the $50 million offer, a life-changing amount of money that would guarantee her family's security forever, and felt only disgust. "Tell your client I reject the offer," she told a slick, anonymous lawyer on the other end of the line. "Tell him that some things are worth more than a zero on a bank statement." Graham Thorne's lawyer sputtered, shocked. Althea was refusing to be silenced, choosing truth and justice over obscene wealth. She hung up the phone feeling lighter, but also exposed. She knew this rejection meant the Thornes would stop playing games and start fighting dirty. She wasn't just fighting a lawsuit anymore. She was fighting a dynasty. Her father, initially hesitant, looked at her with pure, unadulterated pride. "You're your grandfather's child, Althea. You just gave up a kingdom to fight for what's right." The less extreme event was a necessary pause for reflection. Althea drove out of the city to a quiet, historic cemetery where her family's ancestors were buried. She found the modest, older stone for Alara Vance, the woman whose courage and tragic life were now defining Althea's own destiny. Standing over the grave, Althea felt a profound, chilling connection. Alara had been erased, her love and her child stolen by the very man Althea had fought so hard to save. "I won't let them erase you again, Great Aunt Alara," Althea whispered, running her hand over the cool stone. The moment was peaceful, but it fueled a burning resolve inside her. She felt like a detective and an avenger, driven by a history she hadn't even known existed until a few days ago. The quiet visit was a vow, a commitment to right a wrong that had festered in her family for decades. That evening, a beat-up courier van pulled up to Althea's curb. The driver, looking nervous, handed her a small, heavy package wrapped in thick brown paper. It was from Francine, the terrified former administrative assistant. Althea rushed inside, ripping off the paper. Inside lay a small, tarnished metal box, the kind people use to keep jewelry or important papers safe. It was locked, heavy, and clearly very old. The extreme event wasn't the box itself, but the chilling realization of what it might contain. Francine hadn't been able to talk, but she had managed to deliver something that Sterling, Thorne, and Graham had spent half a century trying to hide. Althea scrambled for tools, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to know what was inside. She had to know her great aunt's final words. This little box contained the ultimate truth, and no amount of money could buy it back. Althea didn't wait. She found a heavy wrench in the garage and pried open the antique metal box. The extreme event was the sound of the old hinges screeching as the lock finally snapped. She pulled out the contents, her hands trembling. Inside were three things: a stack of faded, handwritten letters tied with a ribbon, a delicate, dried flower, and a folded, stiff document that looked like a legal file. She started with the letters. The less extreme event was reading them, the slow, heartbreaking discovery of Alara Vance's voice. The letters were addressed to a friend, detailing Alara's forbidden, passionate, and ultimately doomed romance with the younger, less hardened Sterling Thorne. They spoke of a secret wedding, immense happiness, and then the sudden, crushing cruelty of the Thorne family when they found out Alara was both black and pregnant. The letters revealed a life consumed by heartbreak, forced separation, and the desperate realization that her beloved husband had been too weak to stand up to his father's powerful prejudice. The letters were a powerful indictment of Sterling Thorne's past, a record of how he chose wealth and security over love and integrity. Althea felt a strange mix of sorrow for Alara and rage at the system that had crushed her. But it was the final document, the stiff piece of paper, that held the ultimate explosive truth. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the official letterhead. It was an amendment to Sterling Thorne's original prenuptial agreement, drafted secretly by Alara and her lawyer right before she vanished. It detailed her share of the new Thorne real estate holdings, stating that in the event of her premature death, a significant portion of the family assets, not just a small trust, would be transferred directly to her next of kin. Alara hadn't just sued, she had prepared for the worst. The extreme event was the name listed as the ultimate beneficiary, not her direct family, but an entire separate branch of her lineage, the line that descended from her sister, Althea's grandmother, Ruth. The document established that Althea Vance, the doctor who saved Sterling's life and the enemy who exposed his past, was legally entitled to claim ownership of the nursing home's land and a staggering percentage of the entire Thorne fortune. The woman Sterling hated the most was about to become the biggest owner of his empire. The extreme event was the silent, devastating confrontation. Althea walked into Sterling Thorne's room with the three items: the letters, the dried flower, and the will, and placed them on his chest. Sterling was still weak, but lucid. He looked at the documents, then at Althea's face, and he recognized the handwriting, the flower, and the depth of his past sins laid bare. His face went white. He started to deny it, trying to summon his old, furious arrogance. "These are fabrications. A ridiculous lie," he rasped, trying to swat the papers away. But Althea didn't budge. "You can lie to the world, Mr. Thorne," she said quietly, her voice full of controlled emotion. "But you can't lie to her." She pointed to the dried flower, a simple daisy, which Alara had mentioned in her letters as the symbol of their secret wedding. The less extreme event was Althea's deliberate moment of empathy. She sat down, not as a doctor or a lawyer, but as the granddaughter of the family he had wounded. She told him about Ruth, her grandmother, living in the threatened nursing home, and how Alara's story had haunted their family. "You ruined her life, and you ruined the peace of your own family, all because of hate. But I saved you, Mr. Thorne. I chose kindness where you chose cruelty." The emotional weight of her words, combined with the physical proof in front of him, was too much for the old man. His resistance collapsed. Sterling Thorne, the iron-willed billionaire, broke down. He wept silently, his shoulders shaking, confessing his profound weakness and regret. He confirmed the terrible truth. The cover-up, the stolen child, the money that had been used to build an empire on a foundation of lies. The extreme event came as Althea stood to leave. Sterling grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "It's not all me, Althea," he whispered, his eyes wide and panicked. "After I recovered from that time, I tried to make things right, but it was too late. Graham, my son, he found out. He took over the entire operation years ago. The development, the lawsuit, the slander. It's Graham who's controlling the narrative. He's trying to protect the secret and the money from me, too. He's been using my old plans, but now he's trying to eliminate you permanently." The revelation that Graham, not Sterling, was the immediate architect of her ruin was an extreme event. Althea realized she was dealing with two thorns, one weakened by regret and one hardened by inherited greed. Sterling confirmed that Graham, fearful of losing his guaranteed inheritance, had been acting as the gatekeeper, controlling his father's communication and the company's aggressive, racist development policies. The less extreme event was the strange, quiet reconciliation that followed. Althea started to visit Sterling daily, not for medical checks, but for family history lessons. They talked for hours about Alara, his regret, and the weight of decades of guilt. Althea began to see the wreckage of the man beneath the billion-dollar veneer. He was a prisoner of his own past, and she had become his only connection to redemption. "I need you to tell me how to fix it, Althea," Sterling finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "I need you to make sure my wealth is used to correct the wrongs, not to continue them." They began to plot in secret, working through his old contacts and using code words, knowing Graham was listening to every official conversation. They formed an unlikely, fragile alliance. The Black Doctor and the regretful racist billionaire, united against the greedy son. Althea, now working with Sterling's instructions, started compiling a portfolio of evidence and contacting the hospital board directly. She had moved past fighting for her job. She was fighting for control of the Thorne financial empire to save her community. Sterling was signing papers, carefully restructuring his vast network of companies, preparing for a financial bomb to drop on his son. The extreme event happened when Althea's phone buzzed with a coded message from Sterling's old, trusted financial advisor. "The transfer is complete. Graham knows the money is moving. Retaliation imminent." Althea knew Graham wouldn't let his family's fortune slip away quietly. He had lost the legal war, so he would resort to a physical war, targeting the one thing Althea cared about most, her community. The extreme event was the swift and brutal retaliation from Graham. Cornered and realizing his father was actively transferring assets to Althea's cause, Graham used his remaining influence to speed up the land development process. The news broke. Demolition on the Maplewood Assisted Living Facility was scheduled for 7 a.m. the next morning. He wasn't waiting for permits or legal appeals. He was moving a wrecking crew in to claim the land by force, regardless of the elderly residents inside. Althea raced to the nursing home, consumed by a mix of anger and fear. The less extreme event was the desperate, final rally she organized with her grandmother, Ruth. The residents, many frail and in wheelchairs, gathered in the community hall, fear etched on their faces. Althea's voice was hoarse as she spoke to them, her voice cracking with emotion. "We are not leaving. This is our home, and we will stand together against this greedy man." The community was energized, drawing strength from Althea's passion and Ruth's calm resolve. They prepared to peacefully block the demolition crews, putting their bodies in the way. It felt like a small, righteous victory, standing up against a powerful enemy. But the world doesn't always play fair when the stakes are this high. Just as the community was preparing their defense, the sky outside turned a sickly, violent shade of green. The air pressure dropped suddenly, and a shrill, warning alert blared from every phone and radio. The weather broadcast announced an unprecedented, rapid-moving flash flood warning for the entire low-lying coastal area, driven by a freak, extreme weather system. The extreme event was the site of the first rush of muddy, fast-moving water already pooling at the foot of the nursing home. Graham's greedy act of scheduled demolition was about to be overtaken by a sudden, horrifying natural disaster. Althea, the doctor, instantly realized the danger. They were not just fighting a bulldozer anymore. They were fighting rising, dirty water, and the most vulnerable residents were trapped in a facility that was about to flood. The extreme event was the chaos of the rising floodwaters. The brown, swirling current reached the first floor of Maplewood Assisted Living, turning the quiet building into a sudden emergency zone. Althea's medical training kicked in, overriding her personal anger. She became the commander, organizing the frantic staff and the surprisingly calm residents. She directed the strongest nurses to move the most medically fragile residents, those on oxygen or with limited mobility, to the second floor immediately. The less extreme event was the slow, agonizing realization for Sterling Thorne, watching the disaster unfold on the national news from his sterile hospital bed. He saw the aerial shots of the rising water, the frantic movement, and then he saw Althea, waist-deep in the cold, dirty water, carrying a tiny, elderly woman up a ramp. Seeing her bravery and selflessness, despite the evil his family had unleashed, shattered the last of his pride. He finally grasped the depth of her character and the corruption of his own. Althea and her team worked with frantic urgency, turning the nursing home into a makeshift triage center. They used linens to block the doorways, converted the upper floor dining hall into a warm shelter, and made sure everyone had their necessary medications. Althea was a force of nature, shouting directions, comforting residents, and even rigging a temporary emergency power source to keep the vital equipment running. Just when they thought they had everyone safe, a call came through to Althea's walkie-talkie. A maintenance worker was trapped in the basement, and the water was rising fast. It was a perilous, near-impossible rescue. Althea didn't hesitate. She grabbed 2 sturdy staff members and headed toward the flooding stairwell. She knew she was risking her life for a man she didn't know, but that was her oath. The extreme event was the sudden, shocking arrival of a black SUV splashing aggressively through the flood-hit street. Out of the vehicle stepped Graham Thorne. He wasn't in a suit. He was wearing work boots and a panicked expression. Everyone stared, expecting him to order the rescue efforts halted, or maybe just to drive away. Instead, he saw the chaos. He saw Althea's selfless struggle, and for the first time, his inherited arrogance seemed to falter. He jumped into the water and began moving toward the flooded building, not to stop the rescue, but to join it, perhaps seeking a sudden, desperate redemption. Graham's sudden, unexpected presence in the middle of the rescue was an extreme event. Althea stared at him, ready to scream, but before she could, he pointed toward a submerged, overturned car near the entrance. "I saw a child, doctor. A young boy was in that car," he shouted over the whipping wind and water. He wasn't posturing. The panic in his voice was genuine. Althea instantly shifted focus, recognizing the greater threat. The less extreme event was the necessary, silent truce between them. Althea and Graham, the two enemies fighting for the Thorne legacy, suddenly worked together in horrifying synchronization. They fought their way through the surging water toward the vehicle. Graham used his sheer physical strength to pry open the jammed car door, while Althea used her precise, surgical knowledge to check the vitals of the scared, freezing boy trapped inside. As they pulled the child to safety, shivering and coughing, Graham collapsed on a small patch of dry ground. He looked at Althea, his eyes empty of the usual coldness. "I saw the news, Althea. My father, he told me everything about Alara, about the money, about what we did. He didn't make excuses. He just spoke the truth, the trauma of the flood and the sight of the vulnerable child finally cracking his rigid shell." Graham confessed that he had hated Althea because she was the living proof of his father's biggest weakness, love for a black woman, a weakness he felt threatened the family's image. He had simply followed the script, thinking he was protecting the legacy, not realizing he was just perpetuating the generational trauma. The extreme event came when Althea, after handing the rescued child to a first responder, looked back at Graham. He was standing near the entrance to the nursing home, holding a bag of waterlogged company files he had retrieved from his car. He faced the news cameras, which were still rolling, capturing the disaster and the rescue. He didn't turn away. He looked directly at the lens, his face wet with rain and exhaustion, and began his spontaneous public confession. The spontaneous confession was the extreme event that nobody, least of all the Thorne's own legal team, could have anticipated. Graham Thorne, standing in the ankle-deep flood debris, spoke into the rolling news cameras, his voice raw with sudden, profound honesty. He admitted he had orchestrated the entire smear campaign against Dr. Althea Vance. He detailed his manipulation of the hospital board and his acceleration of the demolition project. He didn't stop there. The less extreme event was Graham acknowledging the deeper truth, referencing the decades-old injustice. "My family has caused harm," he said, swallowing hard. "This land, this community, and the Vance family were betrayed for wealth and out of sheer, vile prejudice." He announced that the demolition was permanently canceled and that he would personally ensure every resident was cared for. The cameras zoomed in, capturing a powerful moment of humility and shame from a man who had always represented cold, untouchable power. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Sterling watched the live broadcast with his old financial advisor. Seeing his son finally break free of the toxic cycle and do the right thing was more restorative than any medical procedure. He smiled, a genuine, frail expression of peace, realizing that his ultimate redemption wouldn't be saving his soul, but saving his son from the family's worst sins. The extreme event was the announcement that came immediately after the live footage of Graham's confession. The Thorne family, through a publicist, announced a joint press conference to be held the following day. The participants were listed: Sterling Thorne, Graham Thorne, and Dr. Althea Vance. It was the moment the public would finally learn the full, complex, and scandalous truth that connected the billionaire and the doctor. The entire country would be watching the final dramatic act of the Thorne dynasty. The extreme event was the press conference itself, a dazzling spectacle under the flash of 100 cameras. Sterling Thorne, pale but steady, sat between a newly humbled Graham and a poised, immaculate Althea. Sterling started with a shocking, unequivocal apology, not just to Althea, but to the entire black community. He admitted his father's role, his own weakness, and the systemic racism that allowed the Thorne empire to thrive on injustice. The less extreme event was the slow, deliberate revelation of Alara Vance's story. Althea stood and, with a powerful, emotional clarity, read excerpt from her Grey Tant's letters, sharing the true, tragic love story that was destroyed by prejudice. She spoke of the stolen child, the vanished trust, and the painful history that had been deliberately erased. She showed the faded photograph of Alara, whose face now seemed to look out at the world with a final victory. Then came the announcement. Sterling, with Graham's full agreement, announced the creation of the Alara Vance Reconciliation Fund. He revealed that the entire land parcel slated for the luxury condos, including the nursing home, would be permanently deeded to the Vance Family Trust for community development. The multi-billion-dollar fund would be co-chaired by Graham and Althea, dedicated to fighting institutional racism and supporting underserved communities nationwide. The extreme event was the symbolic, tearful embrace that closed the conference. Althea, the black doctor who saved the life of a racist man who once hated her, turned and embraced Sterling Thorne, who was now her repentant family member. It was a powerful, visually stunning moment of grace and forgiveness that signaled not just a victory for Althea, but a radical, public healing for the Thorne family's dark legacy. The extreme event arrived the day after the press conference, a final, shocking twist hidden in the legal paperwork. Sterling Thorne, having legally protected Althea and Graham as co-chairs of the new fund, had made one last, solitary change to his final will, signed shortly before his public appearance. The legal team revealed the final clause. Sterling had named Dr. Althea Vance as the sole legal owner of his controlling stock in Thorne Industries, citing her profound moral courage and superior judgment. He effectively handed the keys to his entire empire to the woman whose life he had ruined and then helped save. The less extreme event was Althea's quiet, purposeful life 6 months later. Sterling Thorne, having legally protected Althea and Graham as co-chairs of the new fund, had made one last, solitary change to his final will, signed shortly before his public appearance. The legal team revealed the final clause. Sterling had named Dr. Althea Vance as the sole legal owner of his controlling stock in Thorne Industries, citing her profound moral courage and superior judgment. He effectively handed the keys to his entire empire to the woman whose life he had ruined and then helped save. The less extreme event was Althea's quiet, purposeful life 6 months later. Sterling Thorne had passed away peacefully, his last days marked by genuine peace and gratitude. Graham, now fully committed to reconciliation, was managing the fund's global operations, working tirelessly with Althea, who used her new power not for luxury, but to change the world. She oversaw the massive, nationwide expansion of the Alara Vance Reconciliation Fund, pouring billions into education, healthcare, and housing initiatives for marginalized communities. The final scene is set at the newly renovated Maplewood Assisted Living Facility. The building has been entirely restored and expanded, now renamed the Alara Vance Community Center. Althea is standing with her grandmother, Ruth, watching the residents move through the sunny, bustling courtyard. Ruth looks at Althea, her eyes shining with pride. "You didn't just save that man's life, Althea," Ruth says, smiling softly. "You saved his soul, and you finally brought Alara home." Althea smiles back, the weight of the past finally lifted, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. She had won the fight against hatred with kindness, courage, and truth, creating a legacy far greater than any medical achievement. The camera zooms in on Althea's face, radiant with strength and the power of true redemption, finally victorious. If this powerful story of generational redemption and courage against injustice moved you, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to see more complex, emotional dramas like this, and tell me in the comments below, what would you have done with $50 million? Let's talk about it.